Thank you guys all for coming to my presentation today. I'm going to be talking about environmental justice considerations for forecast-informed reservoir operations in California, as Corey mentioned. So water management is becoming increasingly important with climate change. Climate change is causing more extreme drought conditions and more intense precipitation events. In California, these increasingly intense precipitation events are driven by increasingly intense atmospheric rivers. Atmospheric rivers have caused 90% of floods in Northern California. So what is forecast-informed reservoir operations, also known as FIRO, and that's how I'll be referring to it for the rest of this presentation? Is a reservoir operations strategy that uses weather and water forecasts to inform reservoir management decisions for more flexibility within water management. Historically, reservoirs operate on a fixed rule curve that dictate the amount of water released based on historical precipitation patterns. With FIRO, water managers can look at weather forecasts to make decisions instead of relying on those fixed rule curves. Lake Mendocino was the first location to fully implement FIRO, and this graph shows the potential to have an additional water efficiency at Mendocino, courtesy of the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes. The graph shows a FIRO pilot study in the water year 2020. The black line shows the water storage pool with FIRO, and the orange line shows the water storage without FIRO. And you can see with this orange line, it follows the rule curve, which is delineated by the darker blue dashed line. Right above that line, we can see a light blue shaded area, which again highlights that gap by the gap with using FIRO and without FIRO, highlighting the additional water storage we see at this location, which was an additional 19% of water storage going into these summer months, which can be crucial in drought conditions. So why is it important to consider environmental justice for FIRO? Within water resource management projects, emphasis on efficient use often excludes or overlooks equity concerns, which can lead to the exclusion and marginalization of vulnerable communities. Incorporating environmental justice considerations offers an opportunity to take into account equity concerns and involve communities in these discussions. There are also social and environmental justice factors that have been found to impact flood vulnerability and flood resilience. Communities that are typically highly vulnerable to flood hazard include low-income communities, minorities, the elderly, children, people with disabilities, and low levels of education. This leads me to my motivating questions for this project, which were, what socioeconomic and environmental factors are important to consider when evaluating vulnerability to flooding? How much do differing social and environmental justice metrics vary? And what does the case study of the Yuba Feather watershed tell us about the potential for community involvement and equitable implementation of FIRO? For this project, I look at 4 social and environmental justice tools, many of which we've heard about today, starting with the California Communities Environmental Health Screening Tool, or CalEnviroScreen, the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, or CJEST, the EPA's Environmental Justice Screening Tool, or EJ-Screen, and the Social Vulnerability Index, or SOVI. I would also like to point out that this top tool is specific to the state of California, while the 3 tools beneath it are tools used by federal agencies, which I'll talk more about later in my presentation. Within each of these tools, I also look at 3 key indicators, those being education level, elderly population, and proximity to environmental contamination, with 3 subcategories of hazardous waste proximity, cleanup site or Superfund site proximity, and water contamination. I'm going to talk about the methods. I'll start with the statewide analysis, and then a little bit later on, I'll get into the case study more. But to start, the first step was to intersect structures in the National Structure Inventory data set with the floodplain, and in this case, it was the 100-year hazard floodplain, to capture only the structures in that downstream region. These structures were then overlaid with social and environmental justice data that I just mentioned, and then these results of the downstream structures are mapped at each of the 26 reservoir locations that are potential candidates for FIRO implementation. This map is a quick example of what we're going to be seeing when comparing the tools. The size of the circles represent the number of downstream structures in the floodplain, and the colors represent the percent of downstream structures that are above the 75th percentile threshold. So we see areas in green having less than 20% of those structures above that 75th percentile threshold, while the structures in red, or the locations in red, are having 80% of the downstream structures above that 75th percentile threshold, with the idea of being the higher percentage of structures, the more vulnerability in those areas. This is an example of a map for less than high school education that compares results from three of the different tools. There's a few regions that stand out that I would like to point out. The Southern Central Valley, circled here, stands out for having higher percentages of these structures that are above that 75th percentile for education level. And then another area that stands out is Prado Dam and Hansen Dam. And while Hansen Dam doesn't make it into that red category, it has the highest number of structures overall downstream across this map, which makes it an area that might need potential additional research. Another map looks at hazardous waste proximity across three tools as well. There's also some areas that really stand out on these maps, one being Del Valle Dam, circled here, as well as Hansen Dam and Prado Dam down in Southern California, highlighted here. These areas really stand out for having that red category being above, having 80% or more of those structures above that 75th percentile threshold. I also want to point out that across all of these maps, there are slightly nuanced differences, but this map on the far right is the map of Cal EnviroScreen, while the two maps on the left are maps from federal agencies or federal tools. The Cal EnviroScreen map stands out because it has visually very different results than the other two maps. This is a finding that was found all across all of the different maps that I made. So now for the case study, we're going to zoom in onto the Oroville and New Bullards Bar Dam and Reservoir, which are circled here in Northern California. This map also zooms into that region and highlights some of the cities I'll be talking about, as well as where those reservoirs are and where the dam locations are. For the case study, I mapped the overall scores of the Yuba Feather region for the four tools, as well as summarize the findings from an environmental justice in FIRO workshop held in Marysville, California by the Socio-Environmental and Education Network, also known as SEEN, as well as the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes, also known as CW3E. So why focus on the Yuba Feather region for a case study? There is a long history of flooding in this region, and these images highlight some of those flooding events. These photos are from an exhibit at the Sutter County's Museum on flooding and really tell the story of these communities. There have been significant flooding events in 1950, 1955, 1986, and 1997. The floods in 86 and 97 were specifically due to levee failures, which is a unique feature of this region. The photos on the left of this slide are from some of those older flooding events in the 1950s, and they get progressively more recent as we go to the right. This is also not only something of the past. There have been more recent flood scares, such as in 2017, which I would also like to point out was an El Nino year. In February of 2017, the Feather River had received 4.4 million acre-feet of precipitation in 50 days. Damage to the main spillway at the Oroville Dam resulted in the evacuation of over 100,000 people, and this amount of precipitation that they received was essentially equivalent to receiving a year's worth of precipitation in that short time period. This sparked the need for additional conversations about water management in this region. So now for the case study results. These maps depict the overall scores for structures downstream of New Bullards Bar Dam and Oroville Dam. We'll look at this first map as a bit of an example, which looks at the EJ screen tool and counts the total number of flags received. A location receives a flag when it exceeds the threshold for an indicator. The idea is that the more flags there are, the more vulnerable an area is. The next map we'll look at to compare is CGES, which similarly counts a total number of flags. And then there's two more maps. The next in the middle is the Social Vulnerability Index, which also uses a total number of flags. And then lastly, the CalEnviroScreen map, which differs slightly from the other three tools. It calculates an overall percentile score, and then those percentiles are further grouped into deciles, which categorizes the data into 10% ranges. There's a few areas I'd like to highlight within these maps. The first being here, which is the Marysville and Yuba City region. As we can see, some orange and red structures across all of the maps, indicating higher flag counts. Also, as we get closer to Sacramento, we're seeing higher counts of flags across the maps, as well as when we look at the city of Oroville, which is directly downstream of Lake Oroville. These communities, as I mentioned, stand out across all the maps and have had some of these historical flooding cases previously mentioned. I also want to point out that, again, the CalEnviroScreen map stands out pretty significantly, but a caveat of these maps is that they aren't necessarily totally comparable to each other. All of these tools have different purposes and different histories, and so they're not super comparable, but it does still highlight the need to look at multiple tools when doing these types of analyses, as well as to get a more full picture and understand the vulnerability in these regions. So the workshop was held in January of 2025 in Marysville, California, and had many valuable findings, including that community members still hold trauma from these flooding events, especially those in the communities for long periods of time. And community members were able to identify groups that are absent from water management conversations, such as the Punjabi community in Yuba City and Marysville. They also express need for overall more education on topics such as how water management decisions are made and on emergency preparedness. This photo is also from the Sutter County Museum and has a brief blurb about emergency preparedness with the goal of educating community members that visit this exhibit. There are multiple key takeaways I would like to go over with you all from this project. One is that having a tool that can identify social and environmental justice factors that impact flood risk, such as education level or proximity to hazardous waste, can be very useful to inform the equitable prioritization of FIRO. One of the locations that I pointed out in my maps earlier was Prado Dam. That really stood out across a lot of the maps I looked at, and is an area that is having work done, and there's progress on implementing FIRO in that region, although it is a long process. And then while it is helpful, it is important to understand that these tools have limitations within themselves and that there is variation across all of the different tools, making it important to consider a range of social and environmental justice metrics when trying to understand a region. Additionally, future efforts should create a tool specific to socioeconomic and environmental justice factors that impact flood resilience for the better understanding and implementation of climate-resilient water management strategies overall. Because of the potential for nuanced details to be missed in these broader tools that just use survey data, it is also crucial to foster community engagement in water management strategies such as FIRO, because of their local knowledge and their ability to express community needs and concerns that may otherwise be missed by these data sets. Thank you so much. I would like to thank my amazing capstone advisors from CW3E, including Dr. Tom Corringham, Denali Pinto, Jerry Wilcox, and Sarah Ogle, as well as my chair, Dr. Corey Gabriel. I'd also like to thank the leadership of this program, including Dr. Mark Merrifield and Jada Ryan, for their dedication to our program. And last but not least, I'd like to thank my cohort and my family for your support along this journey. Thank you.
Hey, Clara, good job. Thanks for the presentation. That was really interesting. I'm super curious about the CalScreen and FIRO and why it was differing so much from the other ones. And I wanted to know if you have any ideas and if it was differing in kind of the same way throughout your different parameters that you were looking at.
Yeah, so I'll go back to look at those maps. But I think there's a few different reasons to why these tools were differing so much. And for time purposes, I wasn't able to get into that too much. But I talk about it in my paper. One of the things is that these tools are not, the most up-to-date versions of all of these tools don't use the same timeframes with their data. So for example, the EPA's EJ screen uses data from the 2023-24 year, as that's the last year it was updated, while most of these other tools actually use like older data, which is interesting. And then I think another reason is the scale of data used. Most of them use census tract, but there's one that uses block group level, which kind of varies the scale. And then also for the environmental contaminants, there was slight differences in like the data sets, especially for the CalEnviroScreen tool versus like education level. It was the same American Community Survey data. But for like hazardous waste proximity, for example, CalEnviroScreen has an additional list of their own hazardous waste sites that they maintain, while the federal tools are mostly looking at federally managed sites. So I think that kind of also varies the results, but I do think there's additional research that could be done into understanding like what is the main driving factor of these differences.
Thank you, Clara, for the great presentation. One question for you, as we prepare for what could be a historic El Nino event, how did that work its way into your analysis, or did that change the prescience of the work that you're doing and the interactions you had with stakeholders supporting it? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it just makes this project increasingly critical. I think with like an El Nino year, we'll see stronger, well, I'm not an expert on this meteorological side of it, but I think we'll see stronger atmospheric river events, most likely hitting Northern California. And so it's super important to take into account and have these flexibility options available. I will say that from what I've learned, FIRO it's a long and extensive experience, process, which I think is for a reason, because there's a lot of moving components and parts, such as like updating water control manuals for the final implementation, as well as preliminary viability assessments and final viability assessments, because we want to make sure that the forecasts going into these models are accurate enough to be able to accurately predict these intense precipitation events. So I think as we see more like variation, and this El Nino event is a great example of like how we can highlight to policymakers the importance of projects like these that enhance climate resilient water management strategies.